Hello and welcome to another episode of Bare Bones Wargaming, a show with no bells, no whistles, no frills, just a man, a camera, and his game. This episode, it's me! I decided today for the 80th anniversary of one of the most epic military history events ever, I decided to go ahead and be on camera today, which is something I have rarely done. But for this episode, I thought I'd just sit back, talk to y'all, and discuss a few things about Operation Barbarossa, some of my thoughts. You can probably see behind me, I'm still playing Russia Besieged. I was trying a southern, I was trying the original Mark's Pincher idea, and yeah, it's not working out so well, mostly because I got some really bad die rolls in the south. I put the bulk, I put 6 of the 10 Panzer Corps down there, and I rolled ones. Not just twice for like the first impulse, but 4 times for both. So, I may have to go back to the drawing board, or I may have to try it again just because of such bad rolls. What I'm going to do after this play, one of the things I want to talk about here in a minute, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to try the variant which comes in the player's guide for Russia Besieged Deluxe, which basically gives an outline of what if Barbarossa had occurred at the time it was supposed to in May, which is one of the topics to be discussed here this evening. So anyway, so what I'm just going to do is I'm going to kind of discuss a little bit about, a lot of what if Barbarossa things, what if this had happened, what if this had happened, why it failed, which is one of the topics of, hang on one second, this excellent issue of Against the Odds, their annual. There's a nice article in here about why Barbarossa failed. So you can pick that up and read that. I've done a review of Four Roads to Moscow before and such, Hitler Turns East being my favorite one in the group, but that's one thing you can look at. And basically, I just want to start by saying that, what fascinates me about all this is really the military aspect of it. Because when you look at it, there's no good guys here. Neither side. Both sides were just brutal, inhuman, destructive, just awful. Just god awful. It staggers the mind. Everything from, you know what, I don't even want to get into it. It's so ugly. It's just nasty. The book I'm reading right now, which is the most recent book about Barbarossa, just came out. The author's doing a nice job of flipping back and forth between both the military aspect of things, some of the political, diplomatic aspects that were going on with the U.S. and the U.K. and the Soviet Union, but also, things with the Einsatzgruppen and the whole, those units coming through. And it's the kind of stuff to turn your stomach and just chill. So it's the kind of stuff that can just drive you nuts if you think about it too long. Which again is why I always look at it from a strictly military problem. Not to separate it and divorce it from the entire picture, but military history is what I'm interested in. That's the key to me. That's why I study it. That's why I find it interesting and fascinating. So, in that respect, excuse me, this book, which I mentioned to you guys before, I showed before as well, had some interesting points. The author was basically talking about and discussing a chapter where he was saying, the reasons for Germany's defeat, and then, of course, basically, saying, well, here's why it didn't work out. So, anyway, I'm just going to talk about a few of those things, give my own thoughts about them, throw that stuff out there. You can discuss things in the comments if you like, but I just thought it'd be appropriate with the 80th anniversary going on. And then, of course, later on down the road, I plan on bringing out some of my other games as I get closer to, when the German panzers reached Smolensk around the middle of July and such, bring out like a Victory Denied, Moscow 41, things of that nature and stuff. But anyway, so like I said, I just thought I'd go over these points, kind of give some of my thoughts. And again, feel free to comment in the comments section for discussion and stuff. This author actually outlined 6 different major points about why it failed, or explanations for it, and then of course why he thinks either yes or no, and then of course his ultimate thing we'll talk about too with this. Basically, one of the things always is that the Germans just invaded with too small of a force. The force they invaded with, which Craig Luther points out in Barbarossa Unleashed, was just slightly larger than the force that they invaded France with. Now, of course, you could argue if they had had more men, more tanks, any of that kind of stuff, what else would have happened? But you also have to look at it as they accomplished a lot, a staggering amount with the forces they did have. And part of that was because of the qualitative edge they had. Robert Fulchek's excellent 2 volumes about warfare on the Eastern Front, the first one, he does a wonderful job outlining both the strengths and the weaknesses of the German combined arms approach to warfare and why they give them such a huge advantage over the Soviets. But also talking about the weaknesses, because one of the things that the Germans were trained to do was to think of what would be the most difficult thing the enemy could do and then plan for that. So it's interesting because rather than saying, okay, what's the most likely thing they're going to do and how am I going to handle that, this was, no, what's the toughest thing I'm going to come into? Which, of course, one could argue then, well, if you thought of the toughest things, you should be able to handle things that are weaker. But if the toughest thing doesn't match the actual choice the other person made, if it's very far, say, off the decision-making tree, that you're kind of like, wait a minute, hold on, that's just, I didn't consider that at all. That can slow you down too. So his analysis in there was very interesting. It's kind of the book I'm reading right now that I guess, and I didn't know this with this book, so it's good. I mean, I'm learning new stuff from this book, that Stalin used to refer to Guderian as the villain because he couldn't figure out what Guderian was going to do. Guderian was always kind of wrong-footing him, making him look foolish. It's interesting because I haven't seen this approach before. Not that I remember anyway. I mean, after reading so many books and stuff. But my memory's pretty decent, even though I'm almost 50. So, But it's interesting from that perspective with that. But the size thing I don't think was a deciding factor. The more important factor really was the size versus what they encountered. Because the Russians, of course, did not behave like the Poles or the French or the Greeks or anybody else that they came across, because everybody else, eventually reached a point where like, dude, okay, you know what, we can't keep this up, we're done. The Russians were just like, yet, you killed 50, would you bring 50 more? Kind of like the way the old Roman Republic used to be. You destroy a couple of legions, hey, we'll raise a couple more. Hannibal, kind of, the Germans were in the same position as Hannibal, thinking, dude, I'm kicking ass and taking names. There's blood everywhere, and the other side is still going, that all you got? So from that perspective, I think that the force was too small for what they encountered, which was very different from what they had already experienced. That I would say is in my opinion, accurate. But again, how far could they have gotten with extra units and such? Maybe further, maybe not. Maybe the outcome would have been the same. But I don't think it was undersized to the point where it was fatal. Let's put it that way. So, yeah, of course, one of the big ones naturally is, the war would have been won if they had just driven from Moscow in August. That one's a trickier one because you could argue that the psychological impact of capturing Moscow, not only for Russia, but perhaps more importantly for the international audience, could that have been a big thing? There was the whole issue with, the hub of transportation and all that kind of stuff. The fact that they could have been closer to the electric grid for the Soviet Union. You could argue that too if they'd have gotten closer and been able to do that. One book about the air war in the Soviet Union talked a lot about that, about how the Germans just didn't have the bombers with the range, and the Soviets basically had everything on one power grid. Which, of course, if you'd have destroyed that, would that have been game over? Kind of hard to do a lot of stuff without electricity nowadays, So, myself personally, I mean, it's very Clausewitzian, of course, naturally, but it would have been decisive. I don't know. Capturing Moscow and then saying, okay, we've done enough. Let's wait for 1942. Let's just hunker down. Maybe. But, when you look at most of the East Front games, especially the one behind me, that factors in the economic production, most of that was in the South, which of course, Hitler emphasized. The one thing I will say that I think was folly, the more I think about it and the more I game it and the more I read it, was really the whole turning towards Leningrad. I don't think that was worth much of anything. You could argue that it would have secured the flank. Maybe they could have used the Baltic Sea to bring in logistics and stuff. But even if they brought it in the Baltic Sea, you'd still have to put it on railroads, which were wrong gauge, and head it south. I just don't know if that was worth the investment. I mean, going up to Leningrad, yeah. With Finnish full cooperation, where the Finns were like, yeah, you know what, dude, we'll strike. Go ahead and send a couple extra divisions either to help us out, and bam, we'll just, surround the city. Maybe. But I do think that the turning to the north, to Leningrad, I do think that was a waste of time, in my opinion. Now, of course, the argument has been made by David Stahl, or Stahl, I guess, depending on the pronunciation of his name, with his book about Kiev, was that Hitler needed that for a political victory as much as a military victory. Maybe, perhaps, something to bolster the morale of the German Volk, so to speak. But I don't think that was fatal, because that pause, first of all, they had to do it logistically, because Russia turned out to be a logistical nightmare. And this is one of the things that isn't discussed here in this book, but I do think it's something that should be discussed a little bit more, and has been investigated in some recent works, is really the infrastructure of Russia was just not what anybody expected. But then again, it's strange, because a lot of these guys that were commanders on the Eastern Front, they had served on the Eastern Front of World War One as junior officers. They had to have an idea what things were like, unless they were kind of like, nah, man, you know what, they still can't be doing the way things are with the Tsar. Come on. That's one thing that puzzles me when I really think about it and kind of study things and such. How could they have been so unprepared if they had served for how many years on the Eastern Front, and even how far they went with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, occupying all that land? They had to have some idea. So that's a little odd that nobody sat down and was like, there was no discussion at one point being like, guys, look, you remember what Russia was like? Holy cow, man! It's like BFE. Come on, man. It's a little weird to me, but I don't think the divergence was absolutely fatal. I don't think that Moscow falling in 41 would have cinched it completely. I think there still would have had to have been a campaign in 42. So I think that's kind of along the blaming Hitler myth, which I don't think is entirely appropriate. I don't think that was the fatal flaw either. The harsh weather, the weather I do think was an issue when coupled with equipment. Because when people talk about, General Winter, or, even, General Mud, the Rasputista, I think, if I'm pronouncing it correctly there, that by itself, you could say, yeah, weather can be overcome, but when you couple that with the fact that the German tank tracks were narrow, they were not prepared with the lubricants that would work in such cold, harsh weather. Those two things put together, I think, do have an impact. And I wouldn't say that the weather was fatal flaw, but I do think the weather was important. And again, from playing different games that include variable weather, it does make a big difference. When your panzers can move 8 movement factors as opposed to 2, it's like you can't get anywhere at all. But again, fatal, not fatal, but I do think if I was going to rank these things, which I guess maybe would have been a better way to approach this, would have been to rank what I think are the worst or most likely reasons for the fatal flaws. I would probably put this one pretty high up the list, because coupled with the weather, with the lack of preparedness, and again, not like the lack of winter clothing thing, because that has been discussed and debated, and I don't think that as much as an issue as the other two things I already mentioned related to the weather. So I think the weather did have an impact, especially on the speed of things, allowing the Russians to catch their breath. But I don't think it was a fatal flaw, though, either, to be honest. Let's see what's next on the list. Oh, yes, the late launch date because of Yugoslavia and Greece. That is a little trickier to address because, on the one hand, looking at weather, even Russia besieged behind me here, if you want to do the variant starting point, which I'm going to, the first turn is light mud, light mud. So, because the spring thaw, it was, later, it lasted longer. But one could also argue that there's another aspect to this, not just the starting point, but also the wear and tear on the units that were used in Yugoslavia and Greece. And there was quite a few divisions, panzer divisions and such. What if they're all ready to roll, even if there was the light mud, without the wear and tear and such? Maybe. I don't agree with the idea that it was an emotional thing by Hitler. He got angry, revenge and stuff, because I do think strategically it made sense to secure it once it became unstable. With Yugoslavia having the coup, and then of course Mussolini, which what he was doing sometimes. Mussolini always reminds me of Clint Eastwood's famous quote: "This dirty, hairy man's got to know his limitations." I agree, and Mussolini, I don't think, did. He didn't know the limitations of his country either, for that matter. But you take those divisions out of Greece, you stick them in North Africa instead. Ties down more British. You don't have to worry about Greece being in play as much. Maybe still, but then of course there's also the issue, and I think this is interesting. You could speculate and you could compare with D-Day, with the airborne drops that were designed to grab bridges and stuff. According to the Fuhrer directive, I think it's at number 18, was talking about airborne units dropping to grab bridges, destroy infrastructure and things. And of course, when the German airborne was massacred at Crete, that took that out of play. So even if you take away the weather factor, the wear and tear, the casualties, the losses incurred, that units that were not available then for Barbarossa, I could see where that to me would be high up the list. That would be a pretty heavy factor. Not having those units fresh, having those units lose those battle-hardened combat veterans who could have made a difference, really, in the campaign. I do think that. So, from that perspective, yeah, not so much the weather, though. I don't think the weather was as big a deal. Yeah, now this is another interesting one about if Hitler had ignored the generals and instead of putting emphasis on Moscow to begin with, had just driven into the south, past Kiev, towards Rostov, towards the Caucasus right off the bat. None of this playing around with Leningrad, none of this playing around with Moscow, just hell for leather, let's get down, rip and tear everything in the Donbass and take away all those resources, take away the oil, and it's game over. The question is, how far could you get? What would be realistic? As far as, could you really do that? Because you still would have to have substantial forces north of the Pripyat marshes to keep the Soviets in check. But again, logistic-wise, could you supply such a thing? Could you keep things running as much as they did? That's one that you could discuss and debate probably ad nauseum, because there's never really going to be an answer. You could try to game that out, but the thing that's interesting is that every time I've been gaming this, the big issue with trying to put a lot of emphasis in the south, unless you put it in Romania, if you try to put it with Army Group South, is you've got the Pripyat marshes here, then you got the Carpathians, and it is amazing how narrow that space is in between. There's not much room there, to try and get through. It's kind of like a funnel where you can slow things down, and I had that happen when I got those bad die rolls. I got slowed down right away. So I wasn't able to get as far as I wanted to, and I don't even have Kiev captured yet, and I'm about to start the September turn, which, the Kiev pocket wasn't closed until the middle of September anyway, but still, trying to do things faster because we all know that, the clock was ticking. as it were. But that being said, which I tried this a few years ago, and if you're interested, I have a video already posted on my East Front playlist of what I call the Dracula variant, where I put most of the panzers in Romania. But still, couldn't you have gotten that far? Just the sheer distances, the sheer wear and tear, logistical nightmare. Even the rail lines in the south were not quite as plentiful as they were further north. So I don't think it would have been decisive. In the long run, would it give them a better shot? Maybe. Knocking out factories and stuff. If they moved fast enough before they started to really evacuate things. Possibly. But I don't know. I'm not convinced that was a fatal flaw. And let's see, what's the last one that was mentioned here? Oh, yes, the genocidal policies. That one I think actually has some more weight. Because if you had let's say, an authoritarian German army without all the Nazi racial bullshit, without all the genocidal, homicidal insanity, given what had gone on in the Soviet Union, the man-made famine in the Ukraine, and, even Stalin's famous quote that it takes more courage to retreat in the Soviet army than it takes to advance. You couple that with other things that have gone on, like the Katyn massacre and other issues, POWs treated as traitors and stuff. The only way, in my opinion, if you're going to bring down Russia/Soviet Union, you're going to have to do it by destroying the political system. That's why the Germans were successful in World War I, because they were able to take advantage of the volatile political situation to grab all that territory, to basically seal off the Eastern Front. But at a point, of course, where it was basically too late to finish things off and win in the West before the United States showed up. But even though you're looking at past history, when the Poles got all the way to Moscow during the time of troubles in the early 1600s, I mean, just the name itself, after the death of Ivan the Terrible and that power vacuum that there was until Michael Romanov, the distant cousin, was persuaded in memory serves me, around 1635 maybe, when he was finally persuaded to do that. Again, it was taking advantage of the volatile political system. The Swedes failed in the Great Northern War because there wasn't that volatility. Peter the Great ruled with an iron hand, and I do think his people appreciated him. They resisted some of his changes, but I don't think he was feared. I don't think he was like Ivan the Terrible or Stalin. I would definitely not put him in that category. But just it was unified. It was organized, kind of like Alexander the First with Napoleon too. The political system was solid. It was stable enough that you weren't going to be able to take advantage of that. And I think if you can't take advantage of the political system turmoil, Russia is such a big country with so many resources and such a determined, strong, steadfast people when it comes to, fighting and warfare and being invaded, especially being invaded. And I'm sure that's probably because it's part of the collective experience of, been invaded so many times. When people come, you got to dig in your heels, you got to protect everything. We're used to this, so we know what has to be done. Kind of collective history, if you will, passed down from one group to another. I really think that was it. So this author basically said if Hitler had gotten Finland's full support and Japan's full support at the same time, they might have succeeded. Perhaps that would have tied down more forces, would have put more pressure. He's not saying that it would have been absolutely successful, like, yep, that's the way Barbarossa would have been won. But he's basically saying, look, I think that's the best shot. And that's possible. But I do wonder, given the attitude of the Baltic states, of the Ukrainians, I do wonder if that really would have been the more important impact in the end. Ultimately, I will say that a couple of things I'll say here in closing is I do agree with, and I forget exactly which authors have mentioned this before, but a couple have, that Hitler was right to attack in 1941 because even though kind of unbeknownst to the Germans, they really did hit the Soviets at just the right moment when they were at their weakest, when they were just a hot mess, when things were just so befuddled from the effect of the purges on the leadership to reorganizing the mechanized forces. It was just the perfect time, to do that. It's kind of like, it's like in football, uh, making the right play called exactly the right time. Like when the other side has to put in a rookie cornerback because the star cornerback had to limp off the field for some reason, or he was out for a play for whatever reason. It's like that perfect moment where you just exploit that weakness, and bam, you hit it full force. I do believe. I do believe that 1941 probably was the best chance of success, but ultimately I agree with other authors, including Nigel Davis, who wrote the big article in the Against the Odds issue I showed you. I also agree with him that basically it failed because, and again, I mean, there's other authors too that have espoused this position, that it just, the Germans were not prepared for what they faced. They were not prepared for, hey, you know what? We've encircled you. Game's over. Thanks for playing. Here's some nice party gifts for you. Turtle wax for a shinier turtle. That had happened elsewhere for a variety of reasons. Like the Poles, and I've got Polish ethnic heritage in me, but the Poles were just overmatched technology-wise. Eventually, they ran out of room too. Quite frankly, I mean, geography is a huge thing, and I think that's one of the things that might be discussed as a failure too. Was it just a failure of geography? Was it just that the equipment for the time, the strategy, the tactics just were put into a geographical arena where they just would not function? Even just even just not to minimize the resistance of the Russian people and what they did, but just the sheer geographical aspect of it. You know? But I do think that it was just that the German war machine was not prepared for what they ran into, and when they ran into this, they were not prepared for the attrition, the wearing down, and just the fact that it wasn't going to be over quick, and they had to recalibrate their thinking for then what becomes the center of gravity. Initially the plan was, destroy all the Soviet troops you can, west of the Dnieper. But when that wasn't working out, which by the way, there's a book by Brian Fugate from the 80s, which I'm going to reread. I haven't read that book in 30 years, that talks about that aspect of Barbarossa, just how successful the Germans were. So that would be kind of interesting to read. But I do think that may be the fatal flaw. Is just you had the irresistible force, the German Wehrmacht, meeting the immovable object, the Russian people, the attitude, the fight to the last man, knock down, drag him out. You're gonna have to carry somebody out of here in a stretcher, kind of thing, in the ambulance, or to the morgue, if you will. That I do think may have really been the reason that Barbarossa failed. It's just you couple that with the Nazi philosophy, which completely took away any chance of taking advantage of the political situation that was created by Stalin's own brutality, and then couple it with just the fact that you had a war machine that was perfect for dealing with Western Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Europe. But when you shift over there to the steppes, it just wasn't the. It was just not the the adjustments couldn't be made to succeed. I guess is what I'm getting at. Even with with 1942 campaign, it was the wrong tool for the job eventually, and the Germans never did make an adjustment to kind of recalibrate that. So, in my personal opinion, I really think that was the two things that really doomed everything in the end. The other thing I think too is that I think the Lend-Lease aspect, what the British sent, even in their darkest days when they were being pressed in 1941, and of course what the United States sent, I think that is underestimated too, because the more information we're getting about things, and we're seeing some of these firsthand accounts that haven't been released or haven't been seen before. Talking more about the Germans running into American material and British material and such. Later on in September, October of 1941. You take away all that material. That's critical. I mean, when I used to teach, and I used to do a brief unit about World War II. I used to say that even though Stalin was an absolute monster, I don't think there's any debate about that. He was right about one thing. When he did that forced industrialization, which of course cost millions of lives in the end. But I do think that if he does enforce that industrialization, I do think that the Soviet Union would collapse when the Germans invaded in 41. He was right about that when he said, we're 50 to 100 years behind the other countries. They got to make it up in 10 or go under. I do think that he was right about that. So having that industrial piece in place with the Russian character, that you could say, and not being able to pry that apart, not being able to take advantage of the political situation to blast all that to pieces, that I think is why Barbarossa ultimately failed in the end. Just one man's opinion of, that I've been studying this for how many years. I'm not saying I'm an expert. I mean, I'm more than happy to discuss things. But that's how I see it. So anyway, so there's my little discussion. And who knows, maybe if I do another video 10 years from now, on the 90th anniversary, when I'll be, oh man, maybe more information will come out and I'll have a different opinion then. Yeah, possibly. But where it stands right now, the way I see it, that's where I'm kind of looking at things here. So, anyway, to put a period on a sentence. But I'll continue to, explore with the games. That's one of the reasons I love history. I love the military strategy games, is being able to sit down and say, okay, what if this? What if that? Let me try this strategy. I mean, that's part of the allure for me. But you also learn things too. I one of the first games I ever bought was Russian Front, the old Avalon Hill game. And when I had to convert those railroad hexes, which I had not come across that in either books I had read to that point, or I don't think I really had that many war games at that point. But I was like, what? Are you serious? I mean, that was eye-opening. That was my first real lesson in logistics and what a big impact logistics can have on things. So, yeah. So I guess that's kind of where I'm going to wrap this up at this point. If you're wondering about the T-shirt, it is deliberate. There's a website called Redbubble where you can buy historical T-shirts. Yeah, this is what you think it is. It is the big G for Guderian's Panzergruppe. The G's they put on the equipment to signify them. There's lots of history stuff on there. If you start typing in words and stuff, you'll get all kinds of things. And some of the things I would never, purchase myself. But like you can get a T-shirt with Guderian's face on it, but I'm like, yeah, that's a bit much. So I like my stuff to be a little more understated, so to speak, and only really for history purposes and for myself. Yeah, because I just enjoy it. So, okay, I'll close this by just saying here. Sorry. One thing I've noticed about getting older too is that, man, your eyes get tired. It's amazing. I'm hoping at some point this summer to bring to you all an idea I have, my own humble attempt at trying to make a Barbarossa game. I'm having a devil of a time with the map right now because I'm trying to make an area map. Because what I want to do with my game is I want to have a separate panzer phase, if you will, to let the panzers break through the lines like they did, and have it work out, sustaining casualties, and then moving forward, both trying to engage and hold the pockets until the infantry comes up. I'm trying to make that work. I'm thinking also about, after initial panzer lunge like that, having a chip pull system, because, how would you know exactly when the pockets would be reduced? I don't know. So I was thinking about having some, chip pull stuff where you can move the infantry forward, or you might have a chance to reduce the pocket with whatever forces you have at hand, and then sustaining casualties, and you know, having even like a player aid card or something to keep track of each one of the Panzer Corps, and when it reaches a certain point of so many hits on the track, then you lose a step, kind of thing. Flip the counter, rotate the block, depending on the ultimate how it's ultimately organized. But anyway, that's what I'm thinking about. Having a logistics chit too, because the logistics situation became very messy, ad hoc as things went on. So also thinking solo, where I'll have a system that controls what the Russians will do, and then the active player playing the Germans. Because let's face it, in 1941, that's the challenge. The challenge is, can you pull it off? Can you do better? Can you get to the point where you can cause the collapse of the Soviet Union, or put yourself into a position where you can cause that in 1942? So, all right. So, rare public appearance by me. Don't expect to see this again, but I thought for this 80th anniversary I could go ahead and do that. Now I got to figure out what I did with my card. Where did I put my card? Oh, I don't see my opening and end credits card. I don't know where I laid it down. Bugger, 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 bugger. Well, alright. So, this is Tim Korchnoi from Bare Bones Wargaming, saying thanks for watching. Let the discussion and debate begin, if you wish. And I'll see you again next time, probably with more East Front goodness. I will say, one thing I will promise is this. As soon as I get my hands on Absolute War, which is supposed to be coming out hopefully later this summer from GMT, I will definitely share with y'all gameplay, unboxing, as soon as I get it in my grubby little paws, because I feel like I wish I could get my hands on it earlier. I feel like Harvey Korman, I think it's his name. Yeah, and Blazing Saddles, where he's standing there. There must be a way. There must be a way. Yeah, well, I've tried a couple of things so far. Yeah, I haven't pulled it off, but we'll see. You never know. Anything can happen, and it often does. All right, as always, thanks for watching. I'll see y'all again next time from somewhere on the Eastern Front with an Eastern Front game. So, enjoy this look, because it ain't going to happen again anytime soon. Thanks for watching, y'all.